Hey, history students, juniors. This lesson is for class the Monday, October 18th, sorry. It's Wednesday, so I had to clarify that. But your class is coming in here in just a little while, but I'll record a separate lesson for today's class. I haven't even put it together yet, so one of those weeks. Anyway, I still have several of you at home, and so I decided I would go ahead and record my lecture from Monday. I'll probably summarize it. It won't be quite as long as had you been in class, but I will make a copy of the PowerPoint that I'm sending you with this Google Classroom assignment, and so you don't need to take notes unless you want to just follow along. And then I'll make a copy and have it here for you as well. There were several videos that we jumped into on Monday from the John Adams mini-series, particularly about George Washington's administration. And I don't know that I can find those videos online. I own the rights to them, but I'll see what I can find. But in the meantime, I'm going to go over the lessons. So let me get it set up here. Okay. You probably, I think you've actually may have already done it, but I uploaded a Google Classroom assignment for your class this week, and it deals with the death of George Washington, which is a sad little read, but it's very interesting. And since you've been at Mount Vernon and you've actually stood in the doorway of his bedroom where he passed away, thought you'd find it very interesting. So make sure you complete that as well. So we did a little bit of a review on what we talked about last week regarding George Washington's administration. We reviewed his cabinet members again, reinforced the conflict between the Jeffersons and his allies and Hamiltonians, the people that sided with Alexander Hamilton. And as the 4 and then 8 years of Washington's presidency evolved, it became very clear that those were going to be sort of the two camps, and then they would morph into the two primary political parties, Jefferson representing the Democratic Republicans, and then Hamilton representing the Federalists. So just as a point of review, the Federalists tended to support more federal control over states' issues, and the Democratic Republicans tended to favor more state control over issues versus federal control. They were very suspicious of the federal government. And Alexander Hamilton's ideal of assuming the state debts so that the federal government could develop credit, so that they could borrow money, so that they could build infrastructure and help the country expand and grow, meant a larger than what Jefferson was comfortable with federal government. And so they did come to a compromise. They agreed to a federal city, a capital city in the South, in exchange for nominal support of the Bank of the United States and this idea of assuming the state's debts. Let's see, what else did we review? We talked again about the fact that George Washington had a pretty important decision to make when the farmers of Western Pennsylvania rose up and refused to pay the excise tax that Hamilton had encouraged Congress to pass a law regarding. And so Washington took matters into his own hands, raised an army, and went down to enforce the law, which has set precedent for the role of the executive branch in enforcing laws that Congress passes. These were all things that were part of the domestic policy of George Washington's administration. And so today we're going to segue into some of the foreign policy of the Washington administration. The domestic policy of a president has to do with his policy towards things that happen within the home front, within the country itself. The word domestic, if you think of domestic violence, for instance, you think of violence within the home. So the word domestic means within the boundaries of your home or your territory. And so the two-term precedent, the two-party system, the Whiskey Rebellion, and whatever else we had on that slide, represented things that were part of Washington's policy at home. The other one that was mentioned, and this was part of Monday's lesson, is that George Washington did have to deal with conflict in the frontier territories that were gained from the Treaty of Paris and the defeat of the British in the American Revolution. We acquired all of this new land, and there were a lot of native tribes and Indians that lived in those areas. And so there was a lot of conflict with them. Americans rushed to the west at the time, what was known as the Northwest Territory, because it was up there by the Great Lakes, like Michigan. So states like Wisconsin, Indiana, Minnesota, Michigan, that eventually, Ohio, which eventually were carved out of that territory. And there were a lot of Indian tribes there. And so as settlers moved west to acquire land and establish homesteads, that dream of every American at the time, the Indians, of course, were very concerned that their way of life was being encroached upon, and so they began to fight back. At first, it was subtle. I read one account of the Ohio River Valley, which was the forest and the animal life within those forests was lush. There was plenty of venison and other things to feed a family, even if they didn't have livestock. And one of the things that the Native Indians or the Indian tribes did within that area was they started intentionally killing all of the wildlife, not because they needed it to eat, but because they wanted to remove the food source for the settlers, the white settlers that had moved into the area. And that went on for a couple of seasons, and then it's expanded into kidnappings where families or children or scouts, American land surveyors who wandered off to survey the land would just disappear. And they were kidnapped by the Indians. And of course, then eventually it escalated into full-fledged war and large conflicts. And so Washington was constantly hearing reports about this, and many of the Western settlers pleaded with the president to do something to protect them. And so eventually, George Washington raised an army that he sent into the Ohio River Valley in the Northwest Territory to confront a large contingency of tribes that had organized together. And the Miami, I think it was called the Miami Confederacy. I have to go back and look at that, but that doesn't matter. Anyway, unfortunately, the Indians outsmarted the army that George Washington sent into the Ohio River Valley. And I've got a couple of slides here that show the area that we're talking about. So you'll see that in the PowerPoint. And so in this particular battle that is not mentioned in your book, I don't think, but I read the account of it. It's considered the greatest defeat, most decisive defeat of an American military expedition in American history. And so I'm gonna see if I can find this. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on either. That would be helpful. Okay, I thought I had written that on there, but I guess I didn't. Okay, well, I'm just gonna kind of go into it. So, General St. Clair was his name, was the gentleman that George Washington put in charge of this group of soldiers. There were about 1,000 of them. And they went into the Ohio Territory, which was a lot of water, a lot of rivers, lakes, wooded area. It was not an easy trudge. And they went looking for this confederation of Native American tribes that was led by a chief named Little Turtle, which is kind of a funny name. But Little Turtle was smart, he was savvy, and St. Clair thought he was tracking Little Dove, but in reality, Little Turtle, but in reality, Little Turtle and his confederacy was tracking St. Clair and his men. St. Clair and his men settled down one evening after weeks of trudging through the forest looking for Little Turtle and his confederacy, and they found themselves completely surrounded by the Indian tribal tribal warriors. As the sun rose, I think this was, I didn't even put the date in it. As the sun rose, the men found themselves surrounded and being shot at and not knowing where the shooting was coming from. And over the course of 2 or 3 hours, it turned into a complete bloodbath. General St. Clair was severely wounded, or he was shot at several times. His horse was shot out from underneath him. Several of his officers were killed. And the Indians were just so savvy in hiding behind trees that they suffered, I believe I read, only 20 fatalities and maybe 40 casualties. They had an army twice the size of the American army, so almost 2,000 Indian warriors. And they did not relent. They continued to come back and come back and come back, in spite of the fact that the Americans were trying to flee the scene. They were trying to get out of the woods and flee back to a fort that was a few miles down the road for protection. And in Indian warfare, part of the fear and terror of fighting in an Indian war is that they don't just accept a surrender. They keep fighting till everybody's dead or everybody has disappeared. And so that's what happened at this particular battle. This battle has been called several things. The Indians referred to it as the Battle of 1,000 Slain because it killed almost 1,000 white men. It's also called St. Clair's Defeat by historians. And then there's a couple of other names that refer to the land or the river system that goes through there. And it was the most decisive defeat of an American army in American history. They were absolutely crushed. And those that did escape did not have the ability or the time to rescue those that had been wounded. And so those that were left at the camp, several hundred that were wounded from the gunshots of the Indians and the scalping, were left there for the Indian warriors to come back and mutilate. And they did. They went back into the camp. They mutilated, they scalped everybody, dead or alive. One account that I read that a soldier saw his captain freshly scalped, walking around the camp in a daze with steam coming off the top of his exposed skull or brain, I guess. There were a number of women that traveled with the Indian warriors, and their job was to go into the camp after everybody alive was gone, and scalp the remainder of the dead. Why? I guess to invoke fear and terror, which they did. They also mutilated bodies beyond just the scalpings. There were about 200 women and children and servants and others that were traveling with the army, feeding them, cooking meals, washing clothes, that sort of thing. They were all slaughtered. The women were mutilated, their breasts were cut off and burned in piles. Men who had been scalped and killed their bodies had been thrown on piles of fire to further mutilate them. And so there's a reason that Indian warfare is sometimes referred to as savagery. It is not, it would not be something you would commonly see in a European war, for instance. I mean, warfare stinks. In fact, the account that I read said one of the white officers who had witnessed some of this carnage was so freaked by it that when he saw an Indian warrior who was wounded trying to get away, he caught up with him and beheaded him. So anyway, so St. Clair's defeat was devastating to the Washington administration, who had chosen him to lead this expedition against Little Turtle to settle things in the Northwest Territory for settlers who needed the help. In response to this terrible defeat, George Washington ended up sending in another more capable man with his army, General Anthony Wayne. They called him Mad Anthony. He was, I guess, an Irishman that had a way with words, was very animated, and he got the job done. As you will see the pattern, we've seen it in the past and we will continue to see it, that the Indians fight bravely, but over the course of time, their numbers begin to dwindle. Some of the tribes begin to concede, and they run out of steam. And that's what happened. So St. Clair's defeat was kind of the apex of their territorial victory, the Indians in the Northwest Territory, but it was only a matter of time before eventually the uprising was squashed. And so General Wayne led another expedition, another army sent out by George Washington, and did finally subdue the Indian attacks in the Northwest Territory, and thus, as a result of that, more white settlers began to pour into that area and settle that area, and we have all kinds of cities and trade and river trade and all kinds of things happening in that area by the turn of the century. And so one important thing that came out of the final defeat of the native tribes in that area was a treaty that was signed between the various tribes and Washington's government. It was called the Treaty of Greenville. And in the Treaty of Greenville, the Washington government basically agrees to pay the tribes a certain amount of money for the land that they are acquiescing to the white man. So effectively they're defeated, they're forced to give up their land, but to make them feel a little bit better about it, and the white man, I guess, Washington's government to feel a little bit better about it, they conceded to give them a payment for the land. It was small and insignificant, but it was a little bit of a carrot, I guess you could say, to put everybody's ease in mind. And that ends up setting into motion a precedent that will continue through 1900 or so, in which native tribes are defeated and the American government gives them money for the land that they are forced to give to the U.S. government. So that's the Treaty of Greenville. So that's pretty important. A couple of pictures here of the assault at St. Clair's defeat. A picture of General St. Clair. Okay. And then at the end of the slides about Washington's domestic policy, I circle back around again and talk about the two-term precedent that George Washington set. And I asked the class if they knew what the word precedent means. To set a precedent, that means to set a pattern of behavior. And so Washington believed that it was important for Americans to see the peaceful transfer of power from one man to another, and so he stepped aside. He resigned after his second term, but in his farewell address after his second term ended, he delivered a very long speech written primarily by Alexander Hamilton, approved of by him, by Washington himself, in which he warns the country about engaging in two-party politics. He has seen what it had done to his cabinet, and he was very, very weary and concerned that two-party system would be a very negative thing for the country, and so he warns about that. He also warns about entangling alliances with foreign countries. I'm going to read just a paragraph from his farewell address, and then we're going to talk about a couple of the foreign policy issues related to his presidency. So let's see here. Though in reviewing the incidents of my administration, I am unconscious of intentional error, I have nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors as president. But whatever they may be, I fervently beseech the Almighty God to avert or mitigate the evils to which they may tend. I shall also carry with me the hope that my country will never cease to view them with indulgence, and that after 45 years of my life dedicated to this country's service with an upright zeal, the faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as myself must soon be to the mansions of rest. And so then he retires to Mount Vernon, where unfortunately he only lives for a couple of years, sadly. Okay, turning the page very quickly, some of the important events, foreign policy events related to George Washington. Neutrality, neutrality, neutrality. George Washington said we cannot get involved in a foreign war. I know we signed a treaty with the French at the end of the American Revolution so that they would help us. I know that the British and the French are our main trading partners, and they are at war again. But we are not going to pick sides because that would be very bad. And so Washington resists the urge to sign an alliance with the French or with the British, continues to trade with both of them, isn't very successful. The British confiscate our ships that are going to the French. The French don't want us selling to the British. But he believed neutrality was the course of action for the United States. And so in 1793, in the middle of his 2 terms, he signed the Proclamation of Neutrality, which effectively announced to both of those countries that we were not going to pick sides and that we considered both friends and allies, and we were not going to get engaged. This probably upset the French more than the British, because the French had signed a treaty with us and had helped us during the American Revolution to defeat the British. So they logically thought that it was our responsibility to return the favor, I guess you could say. There was a young man, your book refers to him as Citizen Genet. His name was Edmond Genet. He was the French emissary to the United States, or basically ambassador. And he traveled up and down the country soliciting help from American citizens, signing them up, hiring them to go fight the British on behalf of the French, on behalf of the French. So they were American citizens joining a foreign army, which you can't do because our country has announced neutrality. And so essentially it's an illegal activity. And so Edmond Genet is introduced, or he gets an audience with President Washington. We watched the scene of it in the John Adams miniseries. And if I can find it again, I'll see if I'll send it to you. But anyway, Edmond Genet essentially tells George Washington, in the presence of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, Edmund Randolph, and other members of the inner circle, that George Washington must listen to him, and that he speaks to him with the million voices of the people who want to help the French, and that America has a treaty with the French. And Alexander Hamilton reminds Edmond Genet that the French people have beheaded King Louis, who the treaty was with, and therefore the treaty is null and void because they murdered the king. Something else important to understand is that Thomas Jefferson aligns himself with the French, and Alexander Hamilton aligns himself with the British. Thomas Jefferson spent the last 7 years of his life or so in France as a diplomat, and he also helped the French during the Revolution write their own constitution. So his skin in the game is loyal to the French. He's like, we fought a war with the British. Why would we want to defend the British? Alexander Hamilton, on the other side, sees the British economic model, the British legal model, the way their government is formed, understanding that we are at heart British cousins, I guess you could say. And so he sides with the British. And you see that play out in this very tense meeting with the French ambassador, Edmond Genet. He is recalled back to France. Essentially, he refuses to back down, so he is kicked out of the country temporarily. And Thomas Jefferson, just fit to be tied, finally exasperated, resigns his position as Secretary of State. He can no longer work with Alexander Hamilton. He cannot take blows and losses at every turn. And so he sulks back to Monticello, his home in Virginia, and he resigns his position. Alexander Hamilton continues on with the Washington administration, but Thomas Jefferson goes back home, and we will see him a little bit later. Finally, the last little bit here, in an attempt to avoid war with Great Britain, George Washington sends John Jay to England to serve as an emissary and to try to get a peace treaty with the British. John Jay was one of the writers of the Federalist Papers. He was a very respected founding father. He was serving as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and so Washington trusted him. So Jay went to England, or to Great Britain, with the hopes of invoking a peace treaty that would keep us out of war with the British, which he managed to do. However, some of the concessions that he was hoping for, some of the things that were unresolved from the American Revolution, were not handled very well. He got very, very small concessions for the Americans. Like, for instance, the British were supposed to abandon all of their forts in certain parts of North America after the American Revolution, and they had not. And so they agreed to do that, which they eventually did. But most Americans felt like we got the short end of the stick, that we had agreed to all kinds of things that we didn't need to agree to, and that the British got their cake and got to eat it too. And so John Jay came back, a very unpopular man, They say that protesters were burning his effigy, which is basically a kind of a scarecrow-like figure that looks like a person. They were burning those all up and down the United States because they were so angry with him. And then, of course, George Washington ends up signing this treaty into law because he is all about neutrality. And if this treaty will bring peace and not war, he was willing to sign it even though he didn't like everything in it. And so he kind of got dumped in with everything else. So for the first time in his life, George Washington's feeling a little unpopular. People are protesting outside the president's mansion in Philadelphia. People are very, very upset. In fact, there was a contingency of members of the, I think, House of Representatives, the book says, that threatened impeaching George Washington over this. And so George Washington was like, oh, good grief. And so he was ready to retire. He was kind of done with politics. The impeachment threats were a little bit of an overreach that caused the disdain for the treaty and George Washington to some degree to subside. And so he rode out the last couple of years of his presidency without much too unpopular chatter. But he was weary of the task and he was ready to retire to Mount Vernon. He did keep us out of war, so his policy of neutrality was successful. And then finally, the last slide are a list of terms from chapter 6 that cover a whole variety of things, some that we covered, some that we didn't in class. And so I gave everybody an index card and I asked them to, individuals to write down working definitions for each of those. What I'd like for you to do is to go ahead and write a short, brief summary of each of these things on a piece of notebook paper or something that you can hold onto. I don't know if you'll be here for the review, which we're going to do today, and we're going to talk through these things out loud, so I want you to do it on your own. You'll see the terms on the next to last slide in the PowerPoint, or maybe the last slide, and they have the page numbers by them. And so you give yourself a couple lines of space and define each of these and explain the importance of them in this particular context. So anyway, I think that's it. A little more long-winded than I had anticipated, but I will upload this and get this lesson to you on Google Classroom. Mwah. Hope you guys are back soon. Bye.